So in this video, I'm going to talk about game entities with interfaces and inheritance. So first off, game entities just mean like players and enemies and anything that essentially can take damage. So the base entity class, which is has to be derived from mono behavior as it's going to be a component on the game object. This just has health and max health because every entity needs this. If there were to be more consistent factors throughout every entity, they would go here. So this could possibly take name of name, age, gender, anything that would be useful and relevant to what your game is going to have. So in this case, it's just going to be health and max health. So now we're going to move on to the player, which derives from entity. So it has health and max health, but also it has a lot more components. So first of all, it has the controls. So as we saw in the last video, does the controls to control the player. It's stored in the player because it's it's logical to do this. So if we want to control the player, we'd have to go into the player object and then find the controls for it. It just makes sense to put it here because it's connected with the player. The player controller, so this is how we move and look around. The weapon controller, this is how we interact with weapons such as shoot, reload, drop. The animation controller, animation based on the player movement. And video options. I'm going to get back to this one because this is here for a reason, but it doesn't necessarily fit in with player, but it's the most ideal place for it to be. So to start off, when the player entity is first loaded into the game, we set the instance of this component to public static. So what this means is from wherever in code, if we ever want to get this instance of this object, we can call it by going through the class and going through the instance. So what that means, as the player is going to be the only player in the scene, it can be static. So there's going to be no real duplicates of the player, because why would we have a duplicate of a player? But as it's got components which link to game objects, it can't be static. So this is just a way of allowing to get a static instance of your object without having to necessarily make it static straight away. So if I were to define this as static, up here, as you can see there's an error. So even if I made entity static, I would get an error from mono behavior because mono behavior is not static. Because mono behavior is essentially for anything which is connected to Unity in terms of a component. So now we've got all these components, we can access them like we saw in the last video with the controls. So let's use the controls for an example. So we had this example of attack, reload and drop. So the way we get these controls would be to go player, the instance of the player in the scene. We want to go through the controls and then attack, reload and drop. I like to program. So when you call a method, a variable, or even jump to somewhere else, I want it to read like a sentence. So if the player instance, the controls are attack, then for the current weapon, attack. So I hope that makes sense. Okay. So now you might be wondering, what is this? In C# you can't really derive from two different base classes, you can only go through one. Well, this is not a class, this is an interface. So what an interface is, it's kind of like an abstract class, but it's got no functionality. Essentially an interface is a way to help neatly organize your code, but also it has some other benefits which we will shortly go into. So essentially what an interface does, you just define the signatures for various methods. So what this means is if anything is tagged with I damageable, so such as enemy and the player, so it's named I for the specified interface. So what it's saying, within these classes there has to be a method that returns void called do damage, and with the parameters with float. The name can change like anything else, but it's best to keep it reflective of what it actually is. And the same for just on death, there has to be a method called on death. So anything that is damageable is tagged with I damageable, which has to have these methods. These have to be public by default. There is a way to get them private. You can call it directly like this, but it's not the best thing to do. It looks ugly, but also it's a bit confusing to what it actually is. Where compared to this, we know it's a public method called do damage. It's a lot easier, and it's a lot more. We're used to seeing this more often than the interface. So now we've gone through interfaces. So as in there's do damage and on death here as well. The reason that I have not put any other directly related methods into this, more related to entities, is because this could also apply to other things which are not entity based. So if you have some sort of explosive barrel that can be damaged, and these two methods could also apply to the barrel. So the do damage would be like, okay, if this is shot 10 times or the health has reached 0 for the barrel. Also the barrel in this case could possibly inherit from entity as well, because the barrel could have health, so the amount of health before it explodes, and the max health. So whilst this is not really used, it's nice to have just in case. So if you were doing some extreme optimization and you didn't want to instantiate new objects, you could have this in, have it in some sort of object pool and call it reset the health, so you're not having to create new objects on the go. Sorry, and yeah, with the barrel, and then on death, once this is called, then you can make the barrel explode. Okay, so now we've got interfaces. Why are they so much better than having it in some sort of parent class? Well, there's something with interfaces which are not immediately recognizable. So what I mean by that, so this is the code for shooting and applying damage to some sort of object. So what we do is, instead of searching for, let's just say, an entity, so we want to make sure there's some sort of entity, we want to hit it, apply damage, blah blah blah. But with I damageable, essentially the base class can be whatever it wants. It could be a barrel, it could be an enemy, it could be a player, it could be an airship. But as they all implement the interface I damageable, we all know that it has to have the method do damage. So no matter if the parent classes are completely different, if the code that makes up the parent classes is completely different, they could be as far into the spectrum as they want. But as long as they both implement the interface, they both have the method do damage. So if I were to comment this out and do damageable dot, you can see the two methods that apply here, sorry, that show up here, do damage and on death, are the same two methods which are defined in this interface. So this is also, the interface is used for display settings. So this is just in the main menu when you're selecting your video options. Every now and again we want to force the text to update. There was some more options for applying the visual settings and discarding the chosen settings. But another alternative has come round, so those are no longer needed. And that should cover up this video about inheritance. I am going to go into more object orientated and more inheritance and method overriding in the next video.